Imagine standing there at 6:15 on a rainy Monday with the city still half asleep and the sound of tires cutting through wet pavement when a man in a patrol uniform decided that power meant he could treat a stranger like she did, not belong. The black Lamborghini sat under the pale glow of the streetlight, its glossy frame dotted with rain, its engine already off, silent and patient, like it knew something the officer did not. The woman beside it stood calm, elegant, and still, one hand resting near the door as if she had all the time in the world. She was dressed simply, no flashy jewelry, no need to prove anything to anyone. And that was exactly what made the cop smirk. He rolled down his window, looked her up and down, and let his voice carry that ugly edge so many people had learned to fear. "Get out, thug," he snapped, stepping closer before she could even speak. "You think because you got a nice car you can park wherever you want? Move." His tone was harsh, performative, the kind meant to shame first and ask questions never. A few early commuters slowed down on the sidewalk, pretending not to stare, but staring anyway. The woman did not flinch. She only lifted her eyes and looked at him with a quiet steadiness that somehow made the silence feel louder than any argument. "Officer," she said softly, "you may want to check your attitude before you check my license." That only made him angrier. He took one more step, close enough to peer through the window, close enough to see the leather seats, the sleek dashboard, the travel folder on the passenger side, and still he saw only what his own prejudice allowed him to see. He saw a black woman in an expensive car, and decided without evidence and without shame that she was a problem. "I said get out," he repeated, jaw tight. "Hands where I can see them." Her expression did not change, but something in her eyes settled into place like a locked door quietly closing. The rain tapped against the windshield. A bus hissed to a stop across the street. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once and then went quiet again. The officer reached for the handle, not yet realizing how close he was standing to the edge of his own humiliation, because what he had mistaken for fear was not fear at all. It was patience, and what he had mistaken for silence was the calm of someone who had nothing to prove. She slowly reached into her jacket, and for one suspended second, the whole street seemed to hold its breath. The cop leaned in, ready to sneer again, ready to win another small battle he thought had been handed to him by the badge on his chest. Then he saw the edge of the credential, the dark blue cover, the gold emblem, the unmistakable words stamped on the front, and the color drained from his face all at once. His hand froze in midair. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Because in that instant, the woman he had just tried to shame was no ordinary driver, no easy target, no one he could order around to feel powerful for a minute longer. She was FBI, and the badge in her hand had turned the whole scene into a mirror he could not escape. The rain kept falling, the city kept moving, but the officer stood there frozen, trapped inside the one moment he could never walk back from, while the woman looked at him with the quiet, unshaking certainty of someone who had just reminded him what real authority actually feels like. For a second, the rain seemed to soften around them, as if the whole block understood that something larger than a traffic stop had just entered the street. The officer stood rigid beside the black Lamborghini, his shoulders tight, his breathing uneven, his eyes fixed on the badge in her hand as if the metal itself had become a warning he could not ignore. The woman did not raise her voice. She did not step forward to threaten him. She simply held his stare with the kind of calm that makes loud people feel small. Across the sidewalk, a man who had been jogging past slowed down to look. In an apartment window above them, a curtain shifted. Somewhere down the block, a delivery driver eased his van to the curb and watched in silence. The officer had wanted an easy moment, a simple display of control, something he could carry back to the station and turn into a story where he was the one in command. But now the air had changed. Now every word he had thrown at her was hanging there between them, exposed, stripped of its power. His hand, still near the side of the car, began to shake. Not because she had threatened him, not because she had even moved. It was because he had already gone too far, and somewhere in that deep private place where pride starts to break, he knew it. The woman lowered her badge only slightly, just enough to remind him that what he was looking at was real. Her voice came out steady, low, and impossible to misread. She asked him if he understood what he had just done, not shouted. not challenged, asked. And that was somehow worse. Because men like him always expected anger. They expected tears. Fear begging anything they could use to feel bigger. What they never expected was silence, backed by authority. The officer swallowed hard and looked away for half a second, like his own mind had betrayed him. The street still smelled of rain and asphalt. The Lamborghini still gleamed under the weak morning light. But the balance between them had changed completely. He was no longer standing over a helpless woman. He was standing in front of someone whose life training and position reached far beyond this lonely curb on a wet Monday morning. The realization settled over him in pieces, each one heavier than the last. First came embarrassment. Then came fear. Then came the terrible understanding that every second of his behavior had been witnessed by people who would remember it clearly. The woman turned her head toward the car window, then back to him, as if giving him one final chance to decide what kind of man he wanted to be in this moment. He tried to speak, but his words came out thin and useless. He said he had not known. He said he thought the car was unattended. He said he was just doing his job, but his voice no longer carried the weight he thought the badge gave him. It sounded small now, defensive, lost, and she listened without flinching, because she had heard every excuse 100 times before. That was the part that made the moment sting so deeply. She had not won by becoming louder than him. She had won by never surrendering her dignity, even while he was trying to strip it away. Around them, the rain kept moving in silver threads. The city kept waking up, and the officer, still trapped in his own mistake, finally understood that authority is not the same as respect, and that some people carry power so quietly that you do not notice it until you have already revealed the worst version of yourself in front of them. At last she told him to step back and wait for federal confirmation. The words landed like a final verdict. He obeyed immediately. No argument. No swagger. No trace of the man who had barked orders only moments before. He took one slow step away from the car, then another, as if the pavement itself had turned unfamiliar under his feet. The woman looked past him toward the street, toward the small crowd that had gathered without a sound, and then back at the officer one last time. In her expression was no triumph, only the cold, measured certainty of someone who had seen this kind of prejudice before and knew exactly how it ended. He had tried to make her feel powerless. Instead, he had exposed his own weakness to everyone watching, and in that quiet, rain-soaked corner of the city, the lesson was already complete. A badge can demand fear for a moment, but truth always decides who deserves to stand. By the time the rain thinned to a mist, the entire street had begun to feel smaller, quieter, almost suspended in the kind of silence that only comes after a moment of public humiliation has already changed the air. The officer was still standing beside the car, trying to recover the posture of a man who had spent years believing his tone alone could decide how a room, a sidewalk, or a stranger should behave. But nothing about him felt steady now. His jaw was tight. His hands would not stay still. Every few seconds his eyes drifted back to the badge, then to the woman, then to the badge again, as if looking at it long enough might somehow turn it into something less dangerous to him. She remained composed, one hand resting near the open door of the black Lamborghini, the other holding her phone as she waited for the confirmation call to come through. She did not pace. She did not plead. She did not need to. That kind of calm carries its own weight. Imagine standing there and realizing the person you tried to belittle is the only one in the moment who is fully in control. That was the truth settling over the street, now slow and undeniable. A delivery driver had stopped under the awning across the road. A woman with an umbrella had paused at the corner. Even the man in the second-floor window above them had leaned out just enough to see what was happening. Nobody spoke. Nobody wanted to be the first to break the spell. The officer swallowed hard and tried one last time to reclaim authority through words. He muttered something about procedure, about suspicious conduct, about how this was all being handled according to standard protocol. But the sentence lost its force halfway through. He heard it himself. He knew it sounded thin. The woman turned her head toward him with a look that was not angry, not even cold. but patient in a way that made him feel smaller than any insult ever could. "You should have checked before you spoke," she said quietly, and the sentence landed harder than shouting ever could, because she was not defending herself anymore. She was documenting his collapse. Across the street, her phone buzzed once, then again. She answered it without changing expression. A man's voice came through the speaker, low and controlled, and after a brief exchange, her eyes lifted toward the officer with a calm that made his stomach tighten. The confirmation had arrived. Federal. Real. Immediate. He had just spent the last several minutes treating a woman like she was nothing more than a problem to be moved aside. Now every second of that choice was coming back to meet him. His face had gone pale in the rainlight. The confidence he had worn so easily had slipped away so completely that it almost looked borrowed in the first place. He took a step back from the car, then stopped as if his body had finally understood what his pride would not. She closed the phone and looked at him as one might look at a broken rule written out in plain sight. There was no need for a speech. The moment had already spoken for itself. A badge on one side of the street had tried to intimidate. A badge in her hand had answered with truth. And now the difference between power and authority was standing there in the rain, visible to everyone. The officer stared at her, then down at the car, then at the gathering crowd, and for the first time since this began, he looked afraid of what would happen after the silence ended. But the silence did not belong to him anymore. It belonged to the truth. And truth, once it enters a moment like that, does not need to raise its voice to win. The silence after her badge had surfaced did not vanish right away. It lingered over the street like rain caught in the air, heavy and unreal, as if the whole block needed a moment to understand what had just happened. Cars slowed near the intersection. A man on the sidewalk lowered his phone and stared. Even the officer seemed unable to decide whether to step forward again or disappear into the weight of his own mistake. The woman remained beside her car, with calm control, one hand resting near the open door, the other holding the badge at a steady angle that left no room for doubt. She did not speak first. She did not have to. The truth was already speaking for her. Across from her, the officer kept blinking as if the scene might change if he looked hard enough. But it did not. The woman he had tried to reduce to a stereotype was standing there with the kind of authority that does not ask for permission to exist. And now that he had seen it, every second he had spent smirking felt louder than any apology he could have offered. He swallowed, glanced at the broken glass on the pavement, and then looked back at her face, trying to find some small opening where pride might still survive. There was none. Her expression was not cold. It was not cruel. It was quieter than that, and somehow that made it harder to face. It carried the stillness of someone who had already lived through disrespect before and knew exactly how little power it actually held once the truth arrived. A few more people gathered near the curb, careful to stay back but unable to look away. One woman covered her mouth. Another man shook his head in disbelief. The moment had become larger than a roadside confrontation. It had become a public lesson in the difference between assumption and reality. The officer's shoulders tightened under the rain. His radio remained at his hip. His hand hovered near it, then fell away. For the first time since he had stepped out of the cruiser, he seemed to understand that authority was not the same thing as control. Control could be loud. It could be rude. It could even be feared for a little while. But authority lived somewhere deeper. It stood on truth. It stayed when the crowd arrived. It did not need to shout to be obeyed. The woman finally closed the door of her car with a soft, deliberate motion that seemed to echo farther than it should have. Then she took one slow step forward, not threatening, not dramatic, simply certain. The officer's eyes dropped to the badge again, and his face changed in a way the crowd could see instantly. The color drained from him. His mouth parted slightly, but no words came out. He had recognized the emblem, recognized the level of power behind it, and now the full meaning of his mistake was settling over him all at once. What had felt like a small display of arrogance a minute ago had become something else entirely. It had become a problem that could not be laughed off, explained away, or buried under attitude. He had not just insulted a woman beside a luxury car in the rain. He had challenged someone whose work existed to hold people accountable. And now he was standing in front of that accountability, exposed by his own mouth. The woman let the silence stretch. Not to punish him, not to perform, but because silence, when handled with certainty, can make the truth impossible to escape. In that quiet, the officer seemed to shrink. The lines in his face hardened, then softened, then hardened again, as if he were trying to rebuild himself out of panic and failing in real time. He glanced toward his cruiser, then toward the gathering witnesses, then back to her, realizing too late that every eye on the street had already witnessed the moment he lost control of the story. And once that happens, there is no speaking your way back into respect. The badge in her hand did not need to be raised higher. It had already done its work. The rain kept falling steady and patient, washing the street clean while leaving the lesson behind. The officer had come out believing he could decide who belonged and who did not. Instead, he had revealed exactly who he was. And the woman standing there with quiet certainty, and a truth he could no longer deny, had turned a moment of humiliation into something much greater than revenge. It was correction. It was consequence. It was the kind of justice that does not need volume because its presence is enough. He stared at her one last time, and in that stare there was no anger left, only the stunned understanding of a man who had finally seen the difference between power borrowed from fear and power earned through truth. By the time the rain had settled into a thin silver mist, the woman was no longer standing in the middle of a confrontation. She was standing in the middle of a turning point. The street around her had gone quiet in that strange way. It only does after something undeniable has happened, when even the air seems to wait before moving again. The officer still had not found the right words. His mouth opened once, then closed. His eyes kept drifting to the badge in her hand, as if looking at it long enough might somehow change what it meant. But it did not change. It only made the truth heavier. She looked at him with the same calm she had carried from the start. Not with anger. Not with fear. But with the steady patience of someone who understood that time had finally begun to answer back. A woman in a parked car across the street lowered her window and watched. The man near the coffee shop stopped pretending to check his phone. Even the traffic light above the intersection seemed to hold its color a second longer than usual, as if the whole block had been pulled into one long, suspended breath. The officer shifted his weight and glanced toward the damaged window, then back at her face, and in that movement there was a new kind of unease. Not the confidence he had carried when he first stepped out of his cruiser. Not the sharp certainty he had used to command the moment. Just uncertainty. The kind that arrives when a person realizes the story they thought they were writing has already slipped out of their hands. She did not rush him. She did not need to. That was the part he had never understood. She had not needed to raise her voice, and she had not needed to chase the moment. The moment had come to her. And now everyone watching could feel the shift. He had tried to reduce her to a stranger in a broken-down car, a woman he could dismiss with a look and a command. But what he had actually done was reveal how small his assumptions really were. The badge in her hand was not a threat. It was a mirror. It reflected everything he had tried not to see about himself, everything he had dressed up as authority when it was really just prejudice wearing a uniform. She let the silence stretch until it became impossible to ignore. Then she spoke with the kind of controlled clarity that did not need decoration to land. Her voice was low, even, and unmistakably certain. Every word seemed to settle into place as though it had been waiting all along for this exact moment to be heard. The officer swallowed hard. He looked almost younger now, stripped of the hardness he had tried to project. There was no crowd cheering, no dramatic movement, no sudden rescue from the sky. Only the slow, crushing realization that respect cannot be demanded from the wrong place, and that power built on humiliation collapses. The second truth enters the room. She reached into her coat and held the badge where he could see it, clearly not shoved forward, not flaunted, just presented with quiet authority. His face changed in a way the people on the sidewalk would remember later, the color draining from his expression as the meaning finally caught up to him. The woman had not been asking for special treatment. She had been giving him one last chance to see her as a person, before he was forced to see her as something far greater than he expected. And now that chance was gone. The rain tapped softly against the hood of the car, against the street, against the silence itself. The officer stood there with his hands at his sides, unable to move, unable to speak, because he understood what every witness on that corner now understood too. He had not only made a mistake, he had exposed the rot inside it. And in that quiet, rain-washed moment, the truth became the only thing left standing. Her patience had outlasted his arrogance. Her dignity had outlasted his insult. Her identity had outlasted his assumptions. He had tried to control the scene, but the scene had already judged him. And when a man learns too late that the woman he tried to diminish was carrying the authority to end his certainty with one calm reveal, that is not just embarrassment, that is consequence. That is justice arriving without noise. The officer remained frozen beside the cruiser, his eyes darting between her face and the FBI badge, as if the truth itself had physically altered the air around him. Around them, the street stayed quiet. The rain had thinned to a soft, silver mist, falling gently over the hood of the car, the wet pavement, and the small circle of witnesses who had stopped pretending not to watch. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Even the traffic in the distance seemed to pass more carefully, as if the city understood that this was no longer a simple roadside encounter. It was the moment after a lie had collapsed under the weight of reality. She stood there with her hands relaxed at her sides, calm in a way that made his panic feel even smaller. That calm was not weakness. It was discipline. It was the kind of stillness that comes from knowing exactly who you are even when someone else has tried to redefine you with one cruel sentence. He had called her a thug. He had spoken to her like she was nothing more than a problem he could order out of the way. And now, the badge in her hand had turned every one of his words into evidence against him. His throat worked as if he wanted to say something, anything that could pull him back from the edge of his own embarrassment, but nothing came. The apology he should have offered was trapped behind the same arrogance that had brought him here. Instead, he just stared, shoulders tightening, face draining of color as the reality settled deeper with every passing second. A few feet away, one of the witnesses lowered their phone, the recording still running. Another looked from the officer to the woman and back again, trying to reconcile the image of a badge with the way he had spoken to her only moments before. That was the kind of silence that changes a person, not because it is loud, but because it is honest. She did not need to raise her voice. She did not need to prove anything beyond the small silver emblem now resting in her hand. The truth had already done the work for her, and in that truth there was a message far larger than this one street corner. Power built on assumption is fragile, but authority grounded in duty does not tremble when tested. The officer finally looked at the ground, and when he did, he looked less like a man in command and more like someone who had just realized command was never really his to begin with. The rain traced slow lines across his uniform, across the door of the cruiser, across the moment itself, washing nothing away and exposing everything instead. She remained steady, her expression unreadable, not because she lacked feeling, but because she had already carried enough feeling to last a lifetime. She had heard the insult. She had endured the humiliation. She had waded through the arrogance without giving him the reaction he wanted. And now, when the truth stood in the open, it did not need to shout. It only needed to exist. That was the deepest part of the lesson, the part he would remember long after the street dried and the lights changed and the witnesses went home. He had mistaken composure for surrender. He had mistaken her silence for submission. He had mistaken a woman in the rain for someone powerless. But the badge in her hand had revealed something he could not undo. The person he tried to diminish was the one with the authority to define what happened next. And in the end, that is how justice often arrives. Not with noise, not with spectacle, but with a single undeniable truth standing calmly in the rain, while fear learns too late that it has no authority there. She did not move for a long moment because there was no need to rush the truth once it had already arrived. The rain had softened into a fine gray mist, and the streetlights above the intersection cast a pale glow across the wet hood of the cruiser, the dark shine of her car, and the small circle of people who had gathered without speaking. The officer still stood where the badge had left him, rigid and pale, like a man trying to understand how the ground beneath his certainty had disappeared without warning. His hand hovered near his belt, not in threat now, but in uncertainty. His shoulders had changed. His posture had collapsed inward. That kind of silence is heavy. It is heavier than shouting, heavier than argument, heavier than all the noise that came before it. Because silence like that does not protect pride. It exposes it. And in that moment, what the officer saw was not defiance. It was the full shape of his mistake. The woman in front of him had never been what he called her. Not once. Not for a second. She had been calm when he wanted fear. She had been still when he wanted panic. She had been measured when he wanted resistance. And now, with the FBI badge resting in her hand like an answer that needed no explanation, she looked at him as if she were deciding not how to punish him, but how much of the truth he was finally ready to face. Imagine standing there and realizing the person you tried to embarrass was the one person in the entire scene who never needed to raise her voice to win. That was what made the moment so complete. Not the badge alone. Not the crowd alone. It was the way her composure made his cruelty look small. It was the way his certainty cracked the instant he understood that authority had never belonged to the loudest person in the street. It belonged to the one who could remain steady when everyone else was losing control. She let the badge stay visible for one more beat, long enough for the witnesses to see it clearly. Long enough for the officer to feel the weight of every word he had thrown at her. Then she closed her fingers around it and spoke in a voice so calm it almost felt colder than anger. She did not need to repeat his insult. She did not need to chase his fear. She only needed to state what was now plain to everyone there, that he had stopped a woman who had every right to be there. That he had crossed a line he should never have crossed. That the uniform on his back had not given him permission to humiliate anyone. The words landed quietly, but they landed with force. The people watching did not gasp because she was loud. They gasped because the truth had finally made the entire street feel smaller than it had when he thought he was in control. For the first time, the officer looked at the blacktop and nodded her face. It was as if he could not bear to see the person he had reduced standing taller than he ever had. The rain traced down the side of the Lamborghini and gathered at the curb, carrying nothing away, only marking time. She had not needed to threaten him. She had not needed to chase revenge. Her authority was already enough. That is what he did not understand. Until it was too late. Power borrowed from prejudice disappears. The second truth enters the room. Power built on character does not. It remains. It stands. It waits. And when it finally speaks, it does so without apology. One of the witnesses stepped back and lowered a phone that had been recording the whole exchange. Another shook his head in disbelief. Someone near the corner whispered that this could not be happening, but the look on the officer's face said otherwise. He knew it was happening. He knew the moment had turned against him in a way he could not reverse. He knew every second of arrogance had been preserved by memory and likely by camera, and that there would be no easy version of this story he could tell later. The woman took one slow breath, then another. Her face stayed composed, but there was something deeper than calm in it now. There was exhaustion, yes. There was disappointment, too. But beneath both of those was something stronger. It was the steady conviction of a person who had spent long enough in this world to know that dignity is not always protected by the crowd. Sometimes it is protected by patience. Sometimes by restraint. And sometimes by the simple decision not to become what your accuser expects you to become. The officer swallowed hard. His throat moved visibly. His eyes dropped again to the badge, then back to her, then away. He had wanted obedience. He had wanted silence born from shame. What he received instead was a truth he could not command, a truth that arrived in a clean, quiet line and left his entire certainty broken apart. She did not look triumphant in the childish sense. She did not smile at his embarrassment. Her victory was older than that, deeper, more human. It was the victory of being seen correctly after being treated as invisible. It was the victory of standing in plain sight and proving that character does not disappear just because someone arrogant refuses to recognize it. The street remained still. The mist drifted through the lights, and the whole scene seemed to settle into the kind of silence that changes people. Not the silence of defeat, the silence of learning. The officer had spent the entire encounter acting as if his badge made him larger than the woman in front of him, but by the end he looked smaller than the choices he had made. She turned slightly, not away from him in fear, but away from the moment, because the moment had already been decided. What remained now was consequence. What remained was paperwork, witness statements, the slow machinery of accountability, and the memory that would follow him long after the night ended. And as she stood beside her car in the thinning rain, one truth rose above everything else: when someone confuses cruelty for power, the correction does not always come with shouting. Sometimes it comes with a badge in a woman's hand, a calm voice in the rain, and a silence so complete it leaves no place for lies to hide. The first thing she noticed was not the badge in her hand, but the change in the air around her. The street had gone quiet. In that unusual way, silence arrives after a lie has finally been exposed. The officer was still there, still standing beside the cruiser, still trying to look like a man who had not just lost control of the entire moment, but his posture gave him away. His shoulders were tight. His jaw was locked. His eyes kept dropping to the FBI badge, as if looking at it long enough might somehow turn it back into something he could dismiss. It did not. And she did not have to say much to make that clear. She simply stood there in the rain with the kind of calm that does not need to prove itself. Imagine standing there and realizing the person you tried to humiliate is the one person in the scene who never had to raise her voice to win. That was the feeling settling over the street now. Not anger, not panic, just the slow, cold arrival of consequence. A second officer had stepped out from the cruiser, but even he seemed to understand that the balance had changed. He kept his hands close to his sides, and his eyes careful, not wanting to make the wrong move in front of witnesses who had already seen enough. The woman looked across the wet pavement, her expression steady, her breathing measured. The rain had softened into a fine mist, beating on the hood of her Lamborghini and catching in the streetlights above them like broken silver. Nothing about her looked rushed. Nothing about her looked afraid. That was what made the moment impossible to control. The officer who had called her a thug now looked like a man trapped inside his own mistake, forced to stand in the very light he had tried to use against her. He swallowed hard, and for one brief second, his mouth opened as if he might say something, anything that could put the night back together again. But there was no sentence strong enough for that. Some truths do not invite conversation, they end it. She turned her gaze toward him, not with triumph, but with the kind of patience that belongs to people who know the law is already moving in their favor. The witnesses on the sidewalk had not left. They stood under umbrellas, under awnings, near their cars, all of them watching the same man shrink under the weight of the truth he had ignored. One woman lifted a hand to her mouth. A man near the corner shook his head slowly, almost in disbelief. No one was cheering. No one needed to. The scene itself had become the verdict. The officer's fingers flexed once at his side, then stilled. He had spent the entire encounter treating authority like something he could wear and use however he wanted. But authority was not his to invent. It had always belonged to the system he claimed to represent, and now that system was staring back at him through the calm eyes of the woman he had underestimated. She spoke at last, and her voice was level, almost gentle. Not loud, not sharp, just certain. She told him to remain where he was and wait for the supervisors already on their way. The words landed harder than shouting ever could, because they carried the weight of someone who did not need to threaten to be obeyed. The officer nodded once, but it was the smallest, most defeated motion in the world. Around them, the rain kept falling in that quiet, patient way rain does when it has no opinion but still changes everything it touches. The wet street reflected the red and blue lights from the cruiser, her black car and the badge in her hand, and for a moment the whole block looked like a lesson written in color. He had mistaken race for weakness. He had mistaken silence for surrender. He had mistaken a woman standing alone for a woman standing without power. Every one of those assumptions had collapsed in the same instant, and now he had to live in the wreckage of them. She looked past him then toward the far end of the street where another vehicle was approaching slower this time with purpose. The sound of those tires on wet pavement was soft, but it changed the air again. He heard it too, and his face tightened with a new kind of fear, the kind that comes when the first mistake has already been made and the consequences are still arriving. She did not smile. She did not need to. Because justice was no longer something he could delay or debate. It was already there, moving toward him through the rain, calm and undeniable, and he was finally beginning to understand that the worst part was not what had happened. It was that the truth had been standing in front of him the whole time, and he had chosen disrespect before he ever chose understanding. By the time the second vehicle came fully into view, the officer had stopped pretending that he was still in control of anything. He stood beside the cruiser with one hand resting near the door as if the metal might steady him, but even that small gesture looked uncertain now. The rain had thinned into a soft mist drifting through the headlights and turning the whole street into something unreal, like a place caught between judgment and regret. The woman remained still, the FBI badge lowered now, but never hidden because she did not need to display it like a threat. The truth was already doing the work for her. The arriving vehicle rolled to a stop behind the cruiser, and when the driver stepped out, the officer's face changed again. It was not just fear this time. It was recognition. The kind that lands in the body before the mind has fully accepted it. The man moving toward them wore the calm posture of someone who had seen situations like this before and had no patience for anyone who confused authority with arrogance. He looked first at the woman, then at the officer, and then at the cruiser, taking in the scene with a single silent sweep. No one spoke for several seconds. The only sound was rain tapping the hood of the car and the faint hum of distant traffic somewhere beyond the block. That silence carried more weight than shouting ever could. The officer finally swallowed hard. His mouth opened once, then closed again, as if every excuse he had prepared had suddenly become childish in his own ears. He tried to speak, but the words would not gather themselves. She watched him without anger. That was the part he could not understand. She was not standing there to prove she was stronger than him in the way he had always measured strength. She was standing there to show that dignity does not disappear when it is tested, and truth does not become smaller when it is doubted. The man from the second vehicle walked closer, and when he stopped beside her, the officer's shoulders sank another inch. There was no performance in the way the newcomer looked at the badge, only acknowledgement. He knew exactly what it meant, and that knowledge seemed to drain the last color from the officer's face. The woman finally spoke, her voice calm and level, carrying through the mist without effort. She did not raise it. She did not need to. Every word landed cleanly in the cold air. She told him that a badge did not give anyone the right to insult, diminish, or assume. She told him that respect was not a privilege reserved for the powerful, but a responsibility required of anyone who wore the uniform. And she told him with the kind of quiet certainty that cannot be argued with, that the moment he chose to see her as a thug instead of a human being, he had already failed the very duty he claimed to represent. The officer stood motionless while the words settled around him. His eyes lowered to the wet pavement, then lifted again, only to meet the same truth he had tried to push away from the beginning. He had mistaken her silence for weakness. He had mistaken her composure for submission. He had mistaken his own anger for authority. And now each of those mistakes was standing in front of him at once. The man beside her spoke next, not loudly, but with a firmness that cut through the air like a verdict. He made it clear that what had happened would not be minimized, and it would not disappear into another forgotten report. The officer's lips parted again, but this time there was nothing left in him that resembled confidence. He looked smaller now, not because anyone had humiliated him, but because the truth had removed the costume he had built for himself. A man can wear power for a long time and still never know what it means to deserve it. That was the lesson written across his face in the rain. The woman did not gloat. She did not need to. The strength in her silence was louder than his mistake. The strength in her presence was enough. And as the headlights caught the FBI badge one last time, it became clear that the real reversal had never been about one officer losing his nerve. It had been about a moment in which cruelty met consequence and found itself suddenly out of excuses. He had looked at her and seen only what his prejudice allowed. But the truth had been standing there the entire time, patient and unshaken, waiting for him to understand that the law does not belong to the arrogant. It belongs to the honest. And when the honest finally speak, even the loudest kind of disrespect becomes nothing more than a mistake already too late to erase.